This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori. Brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb and I am here in the studio today with Carl Barlev, who is an expert on cars and maybe not cars, but EV cars and all things to do with EV cars. And he just mentioned before we went on the air that actually his name, Carl Barlev, has both EV and car in it, which is just an amazing coincidence. Or is it predestined? Carl, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. No, that wasn't. Somebody pointed that out to me a few years ago, about 5 years into working with EVs. So I hadn't actually picked up on that either myself.
Yeah, it's quite strange, but then I don't know. People like to pick up on patterns, don't we?
Yeah.
We like to have patterns all over the place. Hey, we're here today to talk about EVs, but I thought we would just, at the start, I like to kind of just ask people, where are you coming from? What's your journey to become, just to give context to you as an expert in this field. So you did a Bachelor of Engineering. Now, you sort of started that in Auckland and then shifted to Christchurch University?
Yeah, so Canterbury University we transferred to. I got a scholarship from Transpower in our second year.
Oh,
and the power
right.
industries had this problem back, I did my degree 20 years ago. And back then there was already a shortage of power engineers. So it's old school, it's been around 100 years. It's not sort of exciting and new and innovative so much as, electronics and software and computers.
Power
and
engineers aren't as innovative.
So power engineering wasn't really popular. So to try and encourage more people to do it, the power industry was giving scholarships. Basically, you had a much higher chance of getting scholarships. And I got one of these.
Oh, wow.
In order to basically...
congratulations.
To encourage me to specialise in power. And that's why I transferred to Canterbury,
Right.
where the main power engineers were sort of encouraged by Transpower to transfer down there.
Right.
So,
and can you just go through, just for those of us who are not particularly au fait with all the different sections of engineering, what is power?
As power generation is, where we all get our power from. That powers the,
Right.
powers the studio, powers your house, powers the businesses. Typical industry over the last sort of 100 years has been big generating stations, thermal and then geothermal and wind and hydro at remote locations, typically from where energy is being used, and then you've got the transmission industry, Transpower, and the local lines companies, of which there's 29, I think, in New Zealand,
Right.
distributing it out to the end users. And that has all been is going through big changes now and starting about 10 years ago. I mean, it's because of distributed generation. So you're getting solar power on houses, and that's, it's sort of bringing a lot of change to the industry. The industry's having to think about how that's going to affect how it's operating, and also the financial, incentive, the way the model is built is shifting big time.
Because I guess essentially when we first had power generation in New Zealand, that would have been from small generators, would it?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the very first generator was. New Zealand was one of the first countries in the world to get, street lighting. It was over 100 years ago, I think. We built the big dams, that was sort of 60 years ago, roughly.
So that was a large amount of hydropower.
A lot of hydropower went in sort of, 50, 60 years ago.
And of course, some of that was quite controversial at the time. I remember the Clyde Dam when it went in was very... it was after that the Tekapo, the whole Mackenzie Basin dam. But there's, or hydro, it's complex really, isn't it? Because there's a lot of different... dams there, all in different lakes and rivers and joining up.
We try and get through small hydro systems now, and we still struggle to get them approved. Accepted by society, I guess, in general.
Yeah.
And then
of course the Manapori Dam was also hydro, and that had huge.
And that was then
public
upgraded later with they built the second tail race, which relieves the downstream pressure, which then means you've got a bigger pressure difference between the top and the bottom. So you can get more power out. And
I guess that's still a little bit controversial that the Manapori one with the aluminium smelter there, and maybe it's there, maybe it's going to continue, maybe it's not.
That's been on and off for years. It's sort of like, any industry has to justify, has to be able to cover their costs, and if they can get cheaper power somewhere else, then maybe they'll leave. So I'm not sure about whether or not they would or not.
Yeah.
They definitely have been getting cheap power compared to what most residentials pay. But if they weren't there right now, would have a very big surplus of power in New Zealand. They get roughly 1/3, I think, a quarter to a third of the country's
power. Just from,
I think it's as big as that. Yeah,
from Manapuri.
Not from Manapuri. I mean, Manapuri puts out a big chunk. I'm talking about just the smelter. The smelter
just
takes
the smelter. Really? Does it
of,
take that much?
Yeah, have a look it up maybe, but I'm thinking it's around a quarter.
It's interesting, and I guess with the smelter they have to have continuous power. They can't
exactly.
They can't
shut it off.
They can't shut it off because
huge problems.
It's because of all the
They need to be able to. Yeah.
That's the way that metals work. And that sort of industry. And I guess there are things, I mean, that leads us on to this whole idea of different types of power generation and how some of them are sort of flexible and some of them are continuous, like solar power, for instance, only works when the sun's out.
Yeah, and hydro, which we have majority of here in New Zealand, we're sort of similar to, I think Norway is sort of slightly ahead of us. They're like up at 99, 100%. But we're very, one of the few in the world that's got a significant proportion of hydropower.
Yeah.
And hydropower does have that benefit of being able to just have wind it up and turn it off much more easily than you can thermal power stations.
Because you've got that big storage area, and then you can.
And that's a secondary benefit as well, is the fact you've got the storage then makes wind and solar more viable here than places that haven't got that big buffer of storage, which you can't easily turn on and off. Right, so solar and wind have always had the trouble, like you said, of being not fully reliable. You can't guarantee that you're going to get so many kilowatts or megawatts at any particular point in time, but having that flexible big hydro available there to be able to take up the slack when you need to, that's definitely useful. It's an advantage we've got.
And of course they're all classed as renewable power sources in that I guess they are not consuming the source.
Yeah, well, they're sustainable in the sense, the word sustainable is something that you can continue to do indefinitely, right? So as long as the sun keeps shining and rain, falls and fills the lakes, and we don't use the water too quickly, we've got indefinite power from hydro or from solar or from wind, whereas other sources you are limited by a finite resource, which is being dug up and refined, and so in some cases it's local.
Do we still have in New Zealand like coal-powered power stations?
Yeah, I mean Huntly is still
going, isn't it?
We've still got fossil fuel stations. We've got gas turbine stations that come on, and oil stations. Maybe those types of ones might only come on. They're most expensive, right? So they'll come on at peak demand. So
or when the water level's really low in the hydro lakes.
Maybe a little bit of that potentially, but mostly just in the evenings when the demand on the grid during the day varies hugely. You've got massive fluctuations in demand. It'll go
I heard once that there was like when the World Cup, for instance, in the UK, like at half time, everybody stops and switches on the kettle all at the same time, and it causes this huge, just very short peak that can burn out everything. Yeah,
because the system isn't designed to, it takes into account the fact that everybody's not doing things at exactly the same time, so it averages out, and that averaging effect makes it work. Whereas if everybody did something at exactly the same time, that would be a problem.
And there are certain things that people do tend to do.
Well, like coming home from work.
I mean, people come home from work.
Yeah, we have most countries have a small morning peak and an evening peak.
Yeah.
People get up in the morning and start making breakfast, so there's a small peak in the morning and there's typically a bigger peak in the afternoon.
And I imagine also showers, because
showers not so much. You've got a hot water cylinder. Typically, a lot of those are gas for a start, which then doesn't affect power at all. Even people who are on electric. There'll be a buffer because the hot water cylinder's got a thermostat built in, and it's not going to turn on just because you're having a shower, right? So when the temperature goes down below a certain point, the thermostat kicks in and your cylinder will come on. So you may have a 5-minute delay for one person and a half-hour delay for the next person, depending on how big the cylinder was.
It just sort of evens it out a bit.
And exactly, it evens out a lot more. And that's one way, actually, of trying to harness more, get better efficiency into the power industry is... so if you've got solar power, for example, you can use your hot water cylinder as a buffer to store the surplus power and even out some of that balance out some of the generation and load. There are smart ways of doing that, and that's one thing the industry has to try and do. So one of the presentations I was giving 10 years ago when I first came back here from Norway and was promoting electric cars was looking at how do what is the effect of solar on electric car charging, and how does solar also fit into the power industry? And you've got, solar generation peaks at midday. And
yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because people want to charge their cars overnight, which is exactly when the sun's not there for solar energy.
Not there for solar. The solar also is not. It's outside the two peaks of the morning peak and the evening peak, right?
Yes.
So you've got this big burst of solar generation during the middle of the day, but the peak demands aren't in the middle of the day. They're in the early 7 to 9 a.m. and 5 to 9 p.m.
And what's the solution to that?
Yeah, well, 10 years ago, there wasn't any good solution to that, because I guess it's having a massive battery, right? Having battery storage, right? So battery storage has become more viable with solar power in the last sort of 10 years. It's sort of really starting to pick up now, but sort of starting, 10 years ago, there weren't good lithium storage systems, and lead batteries are terrible for storing energy. And,
why is that?
The cycle efficiency is much lower. They can't handle the high demand. The life cycle's not very good. There's just lots of reasons. And we lived off grid. Lived on Waiheke Island for 10 years in an off grid house which had lead batteries when we moved in. Right. So one of the first things I did when we came back from Norway was to upgrade that to lithium, and it was just black and white, the difference in performance. We could charge the car all night.
Right.
On a similar sized lithium battery pack, which we couldn't do off the lead batteries. So that was just. Yeah,
I guess that brings us to one of the criticisms of the renewable energy, is that even though it's renewable, it's using all these rare minerals like lithium and that kind of mining industry of lithium.
Yeah, lithium hasn't been, people don't really know much about lithium. It hasn't been in our common language sort of thing up until the last sort of 5-10 years. So people sort of think of it potentially as rare, whereas it's not rare at all. It's very abundant in the earth, in the crust and the ocean and everywhere. And it's not a heavy metal at all. It's one of the lightest metals in the world. So
it's right up there at the start of the periodic table.
Exactly,
right?
It's right up there. Yeah. So it's not. One of the problems is the mining and extracting of resources to use for electric cars versus regular cars require resources as well. They've got steel, mostly steel compared to electric cars. It's got all of the same things, but it's also got this big battery pack, which has a lot of lithium. And one of the biggest things people struggle with is sort of saying, you've taken all these resources, but what about all of the petrol and diesel that a regular car uses over its life cycle? Whereas with a battery, you only use it once, like you build it once and it's there. You've got it for 20 years of the life of the car. And then at the end of the 20 years, you've still got the battery. Once you've refined, mined up and refined and transported and pumped your petrol or diesel, it's burnt through the exhaust. It's gone up into the atmosphere.
Right.
You haven't got it there to then recycle and use again.
So what happens to those batteries, those lithium batteries from cars or whatever?
Industry is moving towards being able to recycle them, but there hasn't been any good supply of ones needing recycling yet, right? And it's like with lead batteries, 12-volt batteries out of cars is a great analogy. Like, it's the reason why alkaline AA batteries in New Zealand almost never get recycled. It's terrible. I hate that, but it's just the economics of it doesn't make sense. People don't bother recycling things that's not worth their while, whereas lead, 12-volt car batteries almost all get recycled in New Zealand. There's no regulations around demanding that or requiring it so much. It's more just the fact that they're worth money. So industry then realizes that, and
so how are they recycled? Do they just turn them back into other batteries?
The lead plates with acid. So it's sort of you separate out the acid and take the lead plates out and melt them down and make them back into batteries again.
Right.
It's sort of like a very rough, crude way of describing it.
I'm just after rough, crude ways.
Yeah,
and potentially you could do the same with lithium batteries.
That could easily, it's much easier to take a lithium battery and once take it apart basically back into its constituent parts and rebuild it into batteries, right? And a lot of the battery manufacturers now are incorporating that into their factories, making battery packs because they know it's easier and cheaper to take a existing battery and refine that back into raw materials than it is to take dirt out of the ground, which is high in lithium and whatever else you need, and then refine that, go through and refine that dirt. You can skip out 1 or 2 steps early on.
Yeah, and of course that's the same with aluminium manufacture.
Same with aluminium, same with all the other resources.
That's why we have such good recycling for aluminium cans, because
things that are
recycling aluminium cans
will recycle things that have value, and if there's no value, then you need regulation to try and enforce it or work out what the cost on society is for the fact that it's going to end up in landfill otherwise. So,
but also things become cheaper if they're done in bulk, right? So there's a little bit of supply and demand there, which I think, I don't know about other countries, but I do know that Germany, for instance, made all state housing had to have solar panels on it at some particular point in time, and that meant that there was so much demand for them that they became very cheap. So then more people use them because they were cheaper.
Solar panels have had a huge drop in price over the last, I've been installing them for over 20 years. The first system I sort of helped install on Great Barrier was more than 20 years ago. And that, they were crazy expensive back then, and they've just been coming down and down and down. The curve was sort of slowing down significantly over the last sort of 5 years, but then in the last couple of years again, there's been big drops again.
Right.
So it's just come down even further to the point where it's just no reason why any business or commercial places shouldn't have solar right now in New Zealand, because, like I said before, with the peaks residential morning and evening, commercial buildings which are using power during the day, they can use that power as they're generating it. They're offsetting.
Absolutely, they're doing it during the day. That's when they're using all the power.
They would be buying at peak rates
and
during the day.
So, like that whole thing of supply and demand, that must work with recycling as well. Like if everyone had to recycle their AA batteries or whatever batteries.
A lot of countries require that, right? So there are regulations.
If it's regulated and required, then the demand for people to be able to do that becomes much higher. So then it becomes like
if you put
economies of bulk type thing.
Once you've got enough people doing it and you've got a steady supply, like if anybody who sold the batteries, like they do in some countries, basically had to also have boxes and places return boxes where you could bring them back again, then it would make it easier for people to drop them off whenever they went shopping or something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, that seems like a really easy solution to...
There are ways to make it cheaper on society, and then also increase the viability of recycling them. And that would be great if we could adopt some of those here, but it's sort of, people have been working towards it.
I mean, I don't know if it's still the case, but I think at one stage in Dunedin, when you take batteries, they literally just encase them in cement and then put them in landfill.
That is what I read. So there's a few companies that have got export licenses for recycling, exporting used lithium batteries out of New Zealand to be recycled, like in South Korea and China. There's a few places that actually recycle them now.
Right, which sounds absolutely crazy.
I think Upcycle in Auckland's one of them. If you look at their website, it says that New Zealand still does encase alkaline batteries that get recycled, they get encased in concrete before they go to landfill, which then, slows down the process of them leaching out into the environment, but it's not stopping it. It's going to still happen at some point.
And it's not reusing the resources that are there.
It's not only not reusing the resources, you're actually using up other resources, using concrete and time and energy and diesel with the trucks and everything.
Well, and concrete obviously is high in
energy.
And CO2 emissions as well.
Yep, very high energy stored.
So it seems like a very
a lot of things we could be doing better.
A lot of things we could be doing better in that sort of battery area. And I do think at some point it's not a thing that individuals can do, because one person's lifetime supply of batteries over a lifetime might be, a box. I don't know. But
several boxes maybe.
But over an entire lifetime. Whereas if the government makes a regulation, then it becomes a thing that's available, and then you can make it so it's very easy to do.
Regulation, like with electric car batteries, I don't think it will require so much regulation because
they're
value.
so big.
There's so much
and
value.
They're valuable.
There's 300 kilos, and there's a lot of value in them. Right. There'd be a few $100s at least, sort of per pack. In materials that could be recycled, like 12-volt car batteries that only weigh 15 kgs.
Yeah.
They're worth $2, $3, $4 each, just in the scrap value.
Right. Okay.
And the price does fluctuate, but
is there somewhere in Dunedin that you can take them? Do you know?
There are lots of places you can take. There's a couple of places in Dunedin. There's Everett's and there's Sims Metal, and they take lead batteries.
Oh right. And they'll give you $4 for each battery.
You get a couple of it's 40 cents, 50 cents per kilo.
Right.
The price has fluctuated over the last few years between 20 cents and $1. Like it goes up and down with international. They don't get recycled in New Zealand. They just send them off overseas.
Wow. And they're so heavy. They must go by ship. But
they go by ship. Definitely go by ship. Yeah.
But crazy. Transporting around used batteries. It must. I mean, how difficult is it to do this? It can't be that difficult, can it?
No, they get stored onto pallets, I guess. Boxed up and sent.
No, to actually do the recycling. I mean,
recycling. It comes back again to scale, right? So some of the companies that are doing this are doing it on massive scale. Like they'd use 10 times or 100 times more batteries than we produce in New Zealand per year.
Right.
So then it'd be hard for us to compete. If the full shipping cost was actually taken into account, maybe, because the shipping industry is sort of partly subsidised as well in a way by having much more relaxed rules on the emissions and the quality of the pollution they're making and things like that. So if that cost was fully taken into account, shipping would be more expensive. A lot more things would be viable in New Zealand.
Right. So strange. Goodness me. Wow. Okay. we've kind of gone through batteries. There's one last question that always comes up with batteries and EV cars, and that's this idea that lithium batteries just explode.
Yeah.
And your car goes up. And I don't know what the answer is here, but, and I'm going to get to you giving me the answer there, but I do want to just say up front that every action movie I have ever seen has combustion engines exploding for no apparent reason as they roll down a hill.
Yeah.
Are they more likely to explode than a combustion engine, like a petrol or diesel engine?
Yeah, there's 2 points there. One is the fire burning point. Another part is, as you mentioned correctly, the explosion component, which is significant because I recall, I've been following Tesla since before they started manufacturing cars. I remember the very first Tesla Model S that caught fire in the US. And that was all over the news, of course, because Tesla was just building up. They're just starting to scale production of the Model S over there, and this was all headline news. The guy had driven over a tow hitch that had fallen off a truck or something on the motorway, and it had punctured the battery from underneath. He was driving at 100 kilometres an hour on the motorway. It had punctured the battery pack from underneath. The car warned him that something was wrong, said, the battery has suffered critical failure. It allowed him to basically pull over to the side of the road. He stopped the car. He had time to get out of the car, and then over the next 10 minutes, the car gradually started to burn from the battery, significant damage to the battery pack, basically short-circuiting of cells inside the pack. And then it reaches, thermal runaway of the NCM cells, and they catch fire and you can't put them out. The advice often with that type of battery fire is just to cordon off the area and wait for it to do its thing.
Right.
It's very difficult to put out.
And that is indeed what Chicago Fire do when they obviously a TV reference.
And the key point was, though, that he didn't die from that situation, right? So he got to walk away and, he got to take his personal belongings out of the car and evacuate in a safe manner. Whereas, if you have a significant high-impact accident with petrol diesel vehicles, there is a chance that you will have an explosion almost immediately from the accident. Petrol vapor with sparks don't mix well. And, you can look up the stats of how many petrol car, diesel car fires there are around the world per year versus electric. And I think the numbers are definitely in favour of electric. There are fewer fires in general.
Is that based on the
number of kilometres driven? So you've got to weight it.
You've got to weight it by how many cars that are combustion are on the road.
So per million kilometres driven, how many fires do you have per year? And the numbers are in favour of electric cars. And then on top of that, if you do have a fire, it's not extremely unlikely that it would be an explosion scenario with an electric car, whereas it's much more likely to have an explosion scenario.
And I guess that warning bit there is really quite important. Electric cars, perhaps more than combustion cars, tend to be very much designed to give you continuous feedback on what's happening with all the components, like where the battery is, what's happening.
Cars in general have a lot of computers in them, and they have all headed in that direction, over the last sort of decade or so. Any petrol diesel car as well now has multiple computers controlling everything, and you get signals and sense of feedback. One key difference maybe with the feedback point was that with electric cars, you've got much better feedback on the accelerator pedal in terms of responsiveness. You can't achieve that level because of the mechanical couplings, in a internal combustion engine drivetrain. You're never going to be able to compete with that, and that's sort of partly why electric production car just broke the world record just recently, a few weeks ago, I think it was. Now holds the world speed record for production cars. And I don't think petrol diesel car would ever take that back again. I mean, just from an engineering perspective, if you leave out environmental benefits and all the other reasons people like or don't like
electric cars just go faster.
They're engineering. They're superior on every point. The only thing they're not as good at is making noise. So if you like, petrol heads like loud, noisy cars, electric
and
cars
there was
can't compete with that.
There was a thing with that, wasn't there? They had to add noises in because electric cars were sort of sneaking up on people.
Yeah, so some countries have required the car to make noise below a certain speed limit.
Which is quite ironic. And I mean, I guess it's the same as cars having to make that beeping noise when they're reversing. Yeah,
it's a similar regulation. So some countries require that still, I think, and I don't think it's not required in New Zealand, but there's a requirement somewhere.
I quite like the whole quietness of them.
Well, it's one of the.
I think it's one of the great benefits of them. Although I do see if people are kind of like when you're walking your dog, you're kind of listening out for cars coming on a very narrow road, whatever. And I do sometimes get caught out by an electric car.
Yeah.
But I still think,
the driver's still responsible. I mean, they still have to see you there and they're not going to drive into you.
Like, people are still supposed to not run over pedestrians.
This was a big concern 10 years ago before they became mainstream and people realised it wasn't really an issue. But they're saying, it's dangerous, they're going to hit people.
It's just that thing of everybody getting used to something that they're not used to.
Yeah.
And now you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I do think I read somewhere that the first cars were in fact electric cars.
Yeah, some of the very first cars in the world were electric cars. I mean, I've seen photos of cars from what was like end of 1899 or something, or 1900s, around that time. Some of the very first cars were electric, battery powered, and the similar performance to petrol diesel. It was sort of around. I remember seeing one photo. Was it Tony Seber's presentation down in Wellington? It's up in Wellington. I drove down from Auckland.
Right, yeah.
In a Tesla Model S, actually. I drove down with Steve West. We went to this presentation and he showed a photo of horse and carts. It was somewhere in New York, I think, and it was just like 1900 roughly. And all the cars, no cars. There was all just basically horse and carts.
Yeah.
And within 12 years, basically, there was no horse and carts. Everybody was driving cars.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened here in Dunedin as well. Yep. There was just horsepower and walking power and bicycles, and then all of a sudden there was motorised cars and motorbikes.
And that shift is huge. And you look at it, I mean,
but also, like it had. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt there because it had exactly the same thing in reverse of the quietness of cars. Because of course, the biggest thing that people complained about with cars when they were first on the scene was the noise and the kind of smoke and stuff coming out the back and the noise.
Yeah.
And the very first, I had the guy from Toitu come on last year, and we did a thing about the early transport in Dunedin, and he was saying the very first one, because it was only rich people who could have them, and you didn't have driver's licenses, you had to have an engineer's license to have a car, because
start it maybe
because it was such a big thing. So only rich people had them in the very first days, and they, people who could afford to employ an engineer basically. And the first cars in New Zealand exploded. They blew up on the way because
manufacturing.
I mean, they were early days. They were early days
maybe.
of cars. Yeah, but no, it was very interesting, and it's just interesting to think that then when the mode shift was from horses to cars, the populace didn't like the change because of the noise.
The big population doesn't like change.
Doesn't like change in general.
Or they're slow to change in general. Whereas the adoption curve is very consistently 12 years roughly. That's a very common.
Interesting,
10
isn't
to 15.
It? And then people sort of get used to it.
You get 80% adoption within, max 15 years, but 12 is quite a common number. So you think about smartphones, you think about, fridges, TVs, all this stuff in history, and mobile phones, and it's always often been from nothing, you'll get up to 12, 80% within 12 years.
Yeah, crazy. Oh, yes. So electric cars. So I guess one of the big things that kind of stops people, for want of a better word, or people are nervous about in getting in doing that shift from a combustion engine, petrol, diesel, to an EV is range anxiety. And I wondered if you wanted to address that
was a much bigger topic 10 years ago with the early adopters, people who first started buying electric cars. There was no charging network around New Zealand or anywhere. Like we drove all around Europe 12, 13 years ago when we first got the first Tesla we had. And we had to just literally charge out of people's houses. We'd run an extension lead out. My friend's place in Germany was an electrician as well. We wired a 3-phase cable into his switchboard to get 3-phase power so we could charge faster. In one place where was it? It was in Austria. We had to charge out of a fourth story apartment, basically.
Wow.
down from the kitchen, down to the car, down to the garden across the road, down the street. I dropped the current right down to 5 amps, and it took 3 days to charge the car.
Wow.
So that was slow charging. That was very slow charging, and all of our trips were planned. Like I'd spend like a day or two planning where we were going, and had to just think about where we could charge and how far we could get and where we'd stay. And it was, complicated. Whereas now we've got like ChargeNet New Zealand, which runs most of the fast charging stations in New Zealand.
Yeah.
They just celebrated their 10 years anniversary. It was just this week.
And there are charging stations, those fast charging stations, all over the place. And
ChargeNet has 300, 400. I'm not sure about the exact number, but it's hundreds of charging stations all over New Zealand. And there are a few other providers as well who have some as well. So there'd be another 100 maybe. I'm not sure the exact numbers. And Tesla has its own separate network as well, which can charge other cars besides Teslas.
Right.
Originally, it was only Teslas could charge at their stations, whereas now they've opened up that network to third parties.
which makes much more sense.
Yeah, and it's
We
just
have two parallel systems.
Yeah,
running.
so you've got hundreds of charging stations all over the country. So it's literally even like a Nissan, old Nissan Leafs maybe can't use all of them. They've only got like really 50 kilometres range. You might struggle.
But also, of course, being able to charge at your own house or at any private house has become much easier. No one's wiring up their own systems and three phases and
people ask about that
things.
and they say, can we get fast charging at home sometimes? And I'm like, you don't want, it's expensive. You're going to pay $25,000 to get that, and you haven't got three-phase power, and you just charge slowly overnight.
But you've got the socket,
like
the sockets and the connections and everything.
The car's got both options always,
right?
Or almost always. There's a few cars that only had one or the other, but almost always they've got the slow option AC charging from home or from work or from public AC charging stations, and then the fast charger. They've always got their own cable built in, and there's a couple of different standards. But you can charge much faster, and that's like something you use rarely, though. That's what people say, it takes a long time to charge, but it's like, how often do you do it? Like 98% of most people's driving is to and from work and the supermarket and school.
Right, yeah.
And around town, where none of that's relevant, because you just go home and charge every night. So the total amount of time people spend charging their cars is less than what you'd spend filling up with petrol. Because you're almost never doing it.
Yeah, there's one other thing that there's this whole thing where I guess people are like, is it better to charge with a short fast charge or a long slow charge?
Yeah. So does
it make a difference?
There was a general understanding, just I think possibly because of the Nissan Leaf, the fact that it offered an option to only charge to 80% in some of the early model cars, and people sort of thought then that it was better to only charge to 80. The key thing that matters is not leaving, and it depends on which chemistry you've got. I mean, now there's different types of lithium batteries as well, whereas early on there was only the NCM,
right?
Nickel.
So what's NCM, sorry?
It's a particular type of chemistry that's used, nickel.
Right.
And
do I need to know that to own an EV car?
It's more just knowing whether it does make a difference to how you treat your car. So if you've got the NCM chemistry versus the LFP, lithium iron phosphate, which, some of the cheaper, lower range Teslas and other manufacturers are now using for a lot of their cars, they've got higher cycle life. They'll last longer. You get a longer life out of the car. You don't get the very high range. The energy density isn't quite up there.
Right.
But they last longer, and they need to be treated differently. So the car actually recommends to you, fully charge the car more often.
Oh, so the car tells me what to do.
The car tells you what to do. So,
right.
I'm not sure about all manufacturers do this, but in the Tesla at least, the car says,
I'm not going to be buying a Tesla anytime soon.
Fully charge the car versus only charge the car full when you want to go for a long range trip. So the older models were only fully charged when you need that range. Otherwise, leave it closer to 50%, 60%.
Right.
Whereas the new ones with the LFP batteries, they prefer to be around full charge, a lot more often. So charge it to full at least once a week.
Right. And that's kind of just, with your car, there'll be instructions there.
There's instructions with the car, and the salespeople should tell you as well, this is this type of battery, this is the best way to treat it. And it's sort of not right, or, the other ways, if you don't follow the exact instructions, you might get another 1 or 2% health out of it over several years. So it's not going to make a big difference. It's and like with the 80% charging limit versus 100, it wasn't so much whether you charged it to 100, but how long it spends sitting at 100. So somebody's only using the car once or twice a week, living on Waiheke Island, where I lived for a long time.
So if it sits at 100 for a long time.
That was what was bad for it. It wasn't so much that you charged it to 100, it's the fact that it spends hours. And it's like with a 12-volt car battery, which you leave the lights on and it goes flat, right? It's how long it spends flat that's bad, because it's every second that it spends at that deep discharge state, damage is happening while it's down there, right? So you're basically damaging it when it's in those extreme states that it's not designed for, and the longer it spends at that state, that's what's causing the damage. So if you run your car 12-volt battery flat and it you jump-start it and charge it up again the next morning, it hasn't done so much damage. Where if you're away on holiday and it goes flat and it spends 2 weeks being flat, then it's
done more
damage.
You're
going to have to replace it.
Do you know, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that's a common mistake. And it's also even just like...
So should you leave batteries... You shouldn't leave them either fully charged or fully uncharged?
It depends on type of battery. So car batteries, a 12-volt car battery, lead battery, which all cars have got, more or less, they prefer to be fully charged all the time. So whenever the car's driving, petrol or electric, doesn't matter, the car, either the alternator or the onboard DC charger is charging your 12-volt battery.
Right.
And with electric cars, it's also being charged when the car's being charged at home. So you're plugging it at night, it's being charged then as well. Right, so when we're doing like service on electric cars, I've noticed that over the years that like taxi drivers and things almost never needed their 12-volt battery replaced because they're always being charged.
Always charged.
The car's always being driven all day.
Right.
or it's being charged during the day, or it's being charged at night.
So it's always fully,
So then
almost
the 12
always
volt's
fully
always
charged.
on charge, and then it doesn't wear out.
Right.
And the people who go, use the car once or twice a week and only for a couple of kilometres here and there, their batteries would wear out over 2 or 3 years because they're sitting, they go flat. They don't go flat, but they'll lose a bit of parasitic load to the car occasionally, and they'll discharge faster and not be sitting at 100% the whole time.
Right.
So that's more relevant than. So how you treat the 12-volt battery is often very different to how you treat the main battery in the car.
And so the lithium main battery, so those are the things that basically cost a lot because they're huge.
Yeah, they're very expensive, right? So we actually developed a replacement solution for the Nissan Leaf in blue cars. We spent over $200,000 doing that.
Wow.
Starting 7 or 8 years ago. And it ended up, I was very nervous about doing that when we first took it on because I could see it not being viable, but it was just like, the cars are otherwise in great condition. The engines don't need any maintenance. There's no oil changes. It seems sad to have to throw away the car.
Because the car's got a whole lot of resources, right? Just in the structure of the car.
Yeah, a massive resource, right? So how can we fix that? We need to try and solve that and develop a solution. And we did end up getting to a solution where we could rebuild the battery packs using the existing pack and the existing protection devices and computers and control system. All that stays the same, and just basically replace the modules with new third-party modules.
Right.
And we did develop, we did build a couple of dozen battery packs with that solution, but it was just the cost of them was very expensive, and it was the cost of cars were coming down, and then the government subsidy came along and made the cars even cheaper, which was then directly competing with our trying to service the cars and get them back on the road.
Gosh, that's a little bit of a
non-viable sort of thing. It was just too difficult to make that work financially.
That's a real shame.
Another company in Christchurch actually did the exact same thing that we did. They, we were close, working together and helping each other out. EVs Enhanced, and they went through and did developed a similar solution, like slightly even better than ours. They had liquid cooling in it as well, which the original Nissans didn't have.
Right.
And they also determined after they'd spent a lot of time and money developing it that it wasn't viable. So my understanding is that they've also pulled the plug on that. And
because I imagine there's some people out there who just for kind of reasons, like a lot of people have EVs because they're better for the environment, whatever. They're more sustainable. So that would be quite a number of people would have gone that route for that reason, and then they do, like they might be prepared to spend the same amount of money so that there's not a wasted
definitely
to offset that waste rather, because they're just that sort of people who values not having to throw away an entirely good car.
When we first finished developing and had like a solution that we could start selling, 5-6 years ago, the cost was around $20,000 for an upgrade for an Nissan Leaf, but that would bring the car back to better than what it was when it was originally new.
Right.
When it was originally new, it only had 140k of range. And by the time it was second-hand 10 years old, that had dropped down to sort of 50-60k of range.
Right.
We could upgrade it to 200 kilometres.
Right. Well, that's amazing,
so
isn't
it was, and compared to like a similar, like a 2-year-old 2018 car at that point would have cost them $35,000-40,000. Right. So rather than paying $30,000 to upgrade to a 2-year-old car with 200k's of range, they could just pay $20,000 and upgrade to a brand new battery with a 3-year warranty.
Right.
So that was sort of the finances just barely worked at that point, and then the subsidies came along and made it.
Oh, that's interesting. But now the subsidies have gone.
They were good, exactly. But the cost of batteries have come down, and now there's longer range cars and there's cheaper cars, and it's just
What about all of those Nissans that are floating out there with batteries that have gone down to?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, and it's increasing, and I haven't really been paying attention to how many there are and where they are right now. But I can imagine there'll be a lot of cars that have got very low range. I've got one myself on Waikiki that's down to 40-50k range.
Yeah.
Still works fine for that environment where you only need.
I guess that's the thing, isn't it? There are a lot of people who do a lot of trips that are really quite short.
Yeah.
And actually having one of those older Leaf ones that has a short range, actually if you're just, doing short trips, which is what most people do most of the time.
Yeah. Definitely. So those cars still have value to those markets,
Yeah.
And if you're in a family which has 2 cars anyway, right, then that car could easily replace one of them and do all of your round town stuff in Dunedin, for example.
Yeah.
And then use your other car for longer range trips.
That's an interesting idea, isn't it? It's very crazy. We touched a little bit on incentives there. So there was this period where there was incentives, and obviously a strange byproduct of that is that this whole battery remodeling modelling the batteries and putting them back in and extending the life of the cars, it's kind of a strange byproduct of incentives designed to get more people to have EVs, obviously because EVs are generally lowering our carbon emissions as a country, right?
Yeah, overall, over the life cycle of the vehicles, they definitely produce less, and that's even with old manufacturing, which was using a lot of carbon in the manufacturing process. As the factories become more sustainable and use more and more renewable energy, then that comes down even further. So electric cars have a high carbon footprint in the first year. The manufacturing process is higher than a petrol diesel vehicle.
Is that why is that higher?
Just the carbon cost of the battery as well.
Of the battery is added to the cost of the car.
Added to the cost of the car, the carbon cost of the car, right? But then they use, and this is one of the biggest differences that people don't understand so much about the reason why electric cars are so much cheaper to operate isn't because electricity is significantly cheaper than petrol or diesel, it's because they use significantly less energy. Regardless of what type of energy, they use only 1/4 to a third of the energy to do the same job, to move the car 100 kilometres. Because
they're not producing heat as well, or why?
They're not producing 80% waste heat, right? So an electric drivetrain, that's one of the slides I gave in the presentation I showed you, was the drivetrain efficiency of a petrol diesel engine. You get 10-15% of the petrol or diesel actually gets converted into motion.
Right.
You're
that
losing
seems very
80
small.
to 90% of it in heat loss, mainly heat loss, the thermal bottleneck of the petrol cycle. But also drivetrain efficiencies. You've got the gearbox and transmission, which is another thing the electric car hasn't got so much. It's got a fixed gear,
right.
So you're losing more in the drivetrain, and then you haven't got the benefit of being able to recycle energy. So electric cars can pull energy back out. You can pull the kinetic energy.
So when you're going down a big hill,
when you're going downhill, or when you're slowing down at corners and traffic lights, you're pulling energy back out and using it again, right?
Yeah.
So you can pull it back out through the regeneration, back into the battery, and then use it again to accelerate next time. Yeah. Right, so that
because I do love that feeling of like you've gone up a hill, but then you're going down the hill and you're getting all the energy back, which of course you do on a bike as well, right?
You get some of it back at least. You get 50-60% back in the regeneration, but with a petrol diesel car, you're not getting any back. You're still burning more petrol while you're going downhill, which is just that's like drives me nuts. That's sort of why you burn energy to go downhill. You should be getting energy back to go downhill.
When I was a kid and I was just learning to drive, we lived on a farm which had a big hill on it, and I had siblings, and there was this whole thing about filling up the shared car that we had.
Yeah.
And we used to just put the car basically in neutral. So as we were going down the hill, so it wasn't using petrol.
I think a lot of people used to do that. I remember my uncles and aunts and other family members doing that back in the day. Yeah.
Anyway, do we need? So this is another big controversy about renewable power in general.
Yeah.
There's a lot of this kind of voice around saying if it's so useless, it needs incentives in order to be there and to be viable, then it's not viable, so we shouldn't be having it.
Yeah, so part of the answer to that is chicken-egg question. It's sort of like, well, if you can get over the hurdle of getting up manufacturing or volume production enough to the point where it then becomes viable, then it might be worthwhile spending a bit of money up front to then get to a point where it actually is saving us a lot of money and energy and carbon and everything downstream. Right, and that electric cars have got to that point now. They're sort of being mass produced. The charging stations are happening as well,
and I think solar panels have as well.
And solar panels have big time as well. I mean, all of those things.
The prices come down massively because
so far to the point where it's
supply and demand and
they don't need
scales.
subsidies to be viable. Having fair allocation of costs, where costs are being incurred as well, has also been a problem historically. Where there are costs associated with some industries, which then don't get built into the price, that makes those... So in Norway, they never had incentives on electric cars. Norway was the first country in the world to have massive uptake and adoption. Got to 80-90% of all car sales are electric. They're just like, they're almost
Which
at 100%.
is interesting, because Norway actually has a huge...
big oil industry.
Yeah,
so it's one of the top 5 oil producers in the world, I think. They're definitely making a lot of oil, but selling it offshore. Since long before electric cars, they had a lot of tax on petrol and on petrol diesel cars because of the cost on society, the pollution cost, but also the environmental cost in cities.
It's quite
like you were saying at the start, putting out smoke into the cities.
Yeah.
Right. So they've got huge tax on things that are bad in society in general. I mean, they've got huge tax on alcohol and sugar and smoking as well. Right. So
and of course, lead petrol was a big thing in New Zealand when that kind of lead's bad for us kind of realisation hit the populace, and then.
Better stop doing that.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was the big thing with Norway, was that they didn't have any incentives on electric cars. They just didn't have the massive tax that they had on petrol and petrol vehicles, which then made them a lot more viable.
Right.
Because they were putting all this tax to cover the cost, the full. They take a lot more of the cost into account there than what a lot of other countries do. They just basically let the costs go, or society covers them.
The costs are externalised, aren't they? So the government, which is basically us, picks up the cost of the pollution and the health cost.
There's a lot of sort of disease and health care issues in New Zealand caused by pollution from vehicles in cities, and we all just pay for it in our taxes, and that's not really considered or built into the equation. So then you say, you're subsidising electric cars, but actually we're subsidising petrol diesel as well by covering all of that cost as a society rather than allocating that cost onto the people who are producing it.
And of course the cost of petrol and diesel and the shipping costs that you mentioned before, because that whole shipping industry in effect is subsidised by not paying
a lot of the external cost. Other third world countries are taking the environmental damage cost, the livelihood cost, basically we're benefiting from that and they're paying the cost for us.
Yeah. And of course whenever there's an oil massive disaster somewhere, that gets cleaned up, and that environmental cost also is partly paid by the person or the organisation.
Yeah. They'll get fined and they'll cover some of the costs.
But some of it's just not fixable as well. So that's just a cost that the environment
and the people who live there
is covering. So it's that whole kind of externalisation of the bad parts, the costs.
And those bad parts are sort of have been tending towards getting worse for the fossil fuel industry over the last few decades, because all of the low-hanging fruit is gone. All of the easy access comes out of the ground by itself. Oil, it's all been pumped out and gone, and now they're having to, been resorting to fracking and tar sands and all these other complicated, difficult ways of extracting oil that are a lot more environmentally damaging, a lot more expensive as well. I mean, that's how much oil you spend per oil you get back is like an equation. Like, if you get the money, how much diesel do you spend getting out diesel? Like, in the extracting, all the ships that are doing it, the industry, the transport, the refining, there's a lot of oil required to extract and refine and transport oil. And that ratio is getting worse and worse and worse.
As it gets harder to get.
All the easy stuff's gone. So now it's getting more difficult, and it's just going to keep getting worse.
Can we have a world that is completely fossil fuel free? Like aviation, is that possible to have?
It's fully possible. Like the things that have been holding aviation back, and like ships as well and ferries and things, was just the density of energy storage. And like electric vehicles don't have to necessarily be battery energy storage.
Right.
Like people talk about electric and then they say, but what about hydrogen? That's a different way of doing it. But hydrogen's still electric cars,
right?
Or electric vehicles, because you're just storing the energy in hydrogen rather than storing it in a battery.
Right.
But you're still going to convert to electricity through a fuel cell. You could have hydrogen combustion, but that's just highly inefficient.
Right.
Then you've got the thermal bottlenecks. That's even less viable. So hydrogen would then just basically be a different storage medium.
Yeah.
But it's still going to be an electric vehicle.
And ships obviously used to not be fossil fuel powered, right? They used to be wind powered.
Yeah, and there's
or people powered where they had oars, but I mean big ships used to be
the
wind
Greeks were
powered.
big on the oars. Wind power there are a few small ones trialing trade ships with commercial ships with wind. There's
But I mean the combination of wind, like the big problem with wind was when you got stuck in the doldrums, right? But if you combine that with solar power,
they've got deadlines. They need to be able to reach a certain point on their day for the booked into the ports.
Can you not combine it with solar power?
Solar power is just too small, and people ask the same question about cars, like why haven't the cars got panels on them? And it's just like, if you think about the numbers, a solar panel might be 300, 400 watts.
Oh, it's too small.
Right? Whereas your car is using 30,000 watts.
Right.
So it's just like it's only producing 1% of what you need or 2% of what you need. And it's the same thing for the ships.
Somewhere I heard about having solar panel type paint on the roads.
There's lots of different ways you can extract, different types of technology you can use. I mean, Tesla makes solar roofs, right? You can get these tiles, roof tiles that have solar built in, and it just comes down to the efficiency and the scale of production and, what is the most efficient way of getting solar energy and converting it into electricity. So as long as you're happy to go down in efficiency, then you can use these other types of technology, but the cost goes up then. And then it's not viable, right? So then you're doing it for other reasons, for the aesthetic benefit.
It's that whole economic thing. I've got one more question, so we're just before we run out, and it may not even be in your area of expertise. It's not about cars.
Sure.
It's about wind.
Yeah, I like wind power.
And wind power, what really drives me nuts about wind power is that they always want to put it in these amazing remote landscapes. And I've got two big bugbears with that. Surely the loss in transmission is huge. And there's all the infrastructure for the transmission from remote mountain ranges in central Otago to where most of our power is used, which is in Auckland or the aluminium smelter. And what I wonder, my husband always makes fun of me because whenever we take the ferry from the UK to Europe, we go through Rotterdam or Zeebrugge, and there's this massive big port there, and it looks like something out of, what's that sci-fi movie with the people that everybody loves? Oh, I can't remember it now. Blade Runner. And it's got all the kind of flames going off of things, and they've got silver windmills, which I call them, but obviously they're grey turbines. My husband laughs at me because I call them silver windmills and grey turbines. But that's an industrial, urban environment where they seem completely in place and they're using a lot of power there, and that's where the power generation is right next to it. So my problem is, why can't we do more of that?
We probably can. I mean, the biggest big changes in the wind power industry, which I've been following a long time as well. I took myself to Denmark when I was 18, back to Denmark. I've lived there for a bit as a kid as well. And I actually, partly to go and investigate and learn more about the wind industry. And I actually got a tour of a Vestas factory. This was like 25 years ago now. So I've been interested in wind power for a long time also. My little brother works in the wind industry in Denmark now. So he's an engineer in the wind industry. I think the blades that he works at a company that manufactures blades for this, and they're like 85, 90 meters long. So they're just crazy, crazy big. The wind has transitioned offshore. The most reliable, consistent wind with no obstructions from land and mountains and hills is offshore, right? And then you haven't got people complaining so much about the visual pollution. It's a way where they can't see it. The transmission losses can be managed by just increasing the voltage, the same as what you do on land, right? So voltages get pushed up much higher to then reduce the current flowing in the lines, and it's a square function, right? So every time you double the voltage, you halve the current, you get a quarter of the losses for any given distance, right? And that problem's been the same with power stations around every world. You never have the big power stations in the middle of the city. You always have them out remote somewhere,
right?
And then you've got transmission industry,
and of course we've got that with the hydropower as well.
We've got that with the hydropower, with the geothermal, with everything else. It's all remote sort of thing. It's all being transmitted at very high voltage, hundreds of thousands of volts, and then it gets stepped down the closer you get to where it's being used,
right?
And the same thing happens with the offshore wind. We've got big offshore wind farms with multi-megawatt turbines. Much more efficient, to build one or two big turbines rather than lots of small ones in terms of the installation cost as well. Right? So offshore wind's huge. That's where most of the wind has been developing over the last 10 years. Has been offshore, North Sea up around.
And presumably you can somehow just keep the birds away from the.
Yeah, the bird strike, I'm not sure what the stats are on the bird strikes and how much of an issue that is. I would, if you think about just rotational motion, I mean, the tips of the blades, even though the blades look like they're turning very slow and graceful, the tips are going extremely fast. Right. And the birds have no chance if they're flying through and the blade comes through at 200 kilometres an hour from above them.
I've seen these new ones where they're not blades. They're like I don't know how to even describe that. It's like a thing that spins really fast with a spiral on it. There
are lots of different ways of harnessing, like all these other shapes and styles and things, which is like the Darius wind turbines. They're a lot less efficient. You're not going to get nearly as much energy out of them, right? So they're interesting, and if you want to have it on your house in a residential urban place where it's not spinning and annoying people, then maybe it sort of could have niche uses. But the big 3-blade turbines that are used offshore, that is the most energy efficient. Most efficient way of harnessing power out of the wind.
I don't have time to talk about tide power, but I just wanted to, because every time I'm on the cycleway, there's like this little, from Port Chalmers in, there's this little bit where the cycleway and then it's a bay and the water goes in and out all the time. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's so much energy there. You can feel it rushing through. Yeah. And I just feel like there's so much energy.
It's quite easy to do a sort of back-of-the-envelope calculation, just work out roughly how much energy is available in that source. And I've done those calculations several times whenever I see, because I'm interested in that as well. Like I've sort of often seen estuaries where there's sort of tidal flow and how much energy would that have, and just go through quickly and work out what you would be able to harness from that. And part of the problem is that it's only twice a day or 4 times a day if you're catching both directions going in and out, where it's going to be peak for like an hour or two and then it's dropping off.
Right, so there's that whole storage thing. It's not unreliable though, because it's very reliable. It's very reliable. It happens when it happens, and you know when it's going to happen, which is not quite the same as the wind. And even the solar, I guess, because, Yeah,
exactly. It's sort of more reliable than the wind and the solar because you're more or less always going to get that water flow in and out. But just the total amount of energy available isn't significant compared to, lots of a wind farm, for example, would put out a lot more energy in total.
I'm going to have to sign off here. Thank you very much for coming along, Carl. It's been thoroughly enjoyable and interesting, and I've got the answers to lots of questions that have been bugging me for some time.
No doubt lots that we didn't get to cover today.
But still, thank you very much.
No problem, thank you.
You've been listening to the OI Podcast, the shout-out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI Podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.